I told Claire Bennett I was too old for her on a Tuesday afternoon, standing behind my own workbench with a dead pocket watch in my hands, trying to do the decent thing before either of us got in any deeper. I had it all planned out, a clean, kind, final sort of sentence, the kind a grown man says once and then goes back to his work. She just smiled at me, patient, like I'd said something a little foolish that she'd been expecting all along, and she asked me a question I did not have a ready answer for. "Who told you that?" I want to tell you I had a good response. I didn't, because the honest answer, the one I couldn't quite say out loud that day, was that nobody had told me. I had decided it myself, alone, over 2 years of nights, and I had gotten so used to believing it that I'd forgotten it was a decision at all, rather than a fact of the world. What I did not know yet, standing there with that dead watch in my hands, was that the same afternoon Claire Bennett walked her grandmother's broken mantel clock into my shop for repair. She had walked, without either of us knowing it, straight into a story that had actually started in this very building, 60 years before either of us was born. But before I tell you what that clock turned out to be, do me one quick favor. If you've ever talked yourself out of something good because you'd already decided you didn't deserve it, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is built for the people who finally let themselves be told otherwise. Go on, I'll wait. Now let me back all the way up, because to understand why a dead pocket watch and a broken mantel clock ended up teaching a stubborn man how to stop counting years, you first have to understand a quiet shop, a little girl who missed her mother's laugh, and exactly how a man convinces himself he's finished with love. My name is Nathaniel Cross, and everyone in town calls me Nate. I am 48 years old, and I fix clocks and watches for a living, in a narrow shop on the corner of Main Street that my grandfather opened and my father kept and that I inherited, along with every tool in it, the year my father passed. It's slow, exacting work, and it does not make a man rich, but I'll tell you the truth about it. There is something in taking apart a stopped clock, laying out its 100 small pieces in careful rows, cleaning each one, and putting it all back together so that time starts moving through it again, that has kept me steady through years I'm not sure I'd have survived otherwise. I lost my wife, Diane, 6 years ago, an illness that took 18 brutal months to finish what it started. And in the 2 years right after, I did what a lot of grieving men do, without quite meaning to. I decided, somewhere along the way, without ever announcing it to myself in so many words, that the part of my life where someone loved me the way Diane had was simply over, finished, a chapter closed, and that the honorable thing to do now was raise my daughter well and let the rest of it go quietly. I remember, in those first months, well-meaning people in town, other widowers mostly, telling me it would get easier to imagine loving again, and I remember resenting that advice more than almost anything else anyone said to me, because it felt like they were asking me to imagine replacing Diane, which was never what I wanted, and which I don't think anyone actually meant. It took me a long time to understand the difference between refusing to replace someone and refusing to ever love again, and by the time I finally understood it, I'd already spent 2 years quietly treating the second one like a promise I owed the first. I am raising my daughter, Poppy, alone. She's 9, sharp and funny in the exact way her mother was, and some days looking at her feels like looking straight through a window into the person I lost, which is the sweetest and hardest thing in my whole life, sometimes in the very same breath. She helps me in the shop some afternoons after school, sorting screws by size onto a felt pad, humming to herself, and I have built my whole quiet, careful life around keeping her steady, which is, I told myself, for 2 years, more than enough reason to stop thinking about anything else. That, right there, is most of the story. Everything else is just details. Claire Bennett came to our town 18 months ago, hired to teach 4th grade at the little school Poppy attends, and I noticed her the way you notice weather changing, gradual, and then suddenly, all at once. She was, by every ordinary measure, considerably younger than me, 32 to my 48, and I want to be honest with you about the exact moment I decided that gap mattered more than anything else about her. It was at a school fundraiser, early on, watching her kneel down to Poppy's height to talk to her about a book Poppy loved, patient and genuinely interested, laughing at something Poppy said with her whole face, and I felt something in my chest wake up that I had firmly and deliberately put to sleep 2 years before. And my very next thought, before I'd even let myself finish admiring her, was a cold, practical little voice, reminding me that I was 16 years older, a widower, with a 9-year-old, set in every habit a man gets set in by his late 40s, and that whatever that flicker in my chest was, the responsible thing was to let it pass, without ever giving it a name. I got good, over the following months, at being friendly and careful and entirely closed off, the exact combination that lets two people orbit each other at school events and grocery store aisles for a year and a half without either one saying anything real. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Claire walked into my shop. She had a mantel clock cradled carefully in both arms, an old, handsome piece, dark wood, a face gone cloudy with age, clearly stopped for a long while. She set it on my counter and told me it had belonged to her grandmother, who had raised her for a stretch of her childhood and passed some years back, and that it had stopped running not long after, and she'd been meaning, for a long time, to find someone who could bring it back to life. I want to tell you what happened when I opened the back of that clock, because it's the whole hinge of everything that came after. The moment I lifted the panel and looked inside at the movement, something in me went very still. I have looked inside thousands of clocks in my life, and you learn, the way I learned from my father and he from his, to recognize a maker's hand the way you'd recognize handwriting. This movement, the particular shape of the escapement, a small repair, old but expertly done, on one of the pivots, and, tucked into the corner of the case where almost no one would ever think to look, a tiny engraved mark, initials so worn I had to angle it hard into the light to make them out. E.C. Ezra Cross. My grandfather's initials, and his particular hand at the work, unmistakable to me, on a repair he must have done, by the style of the tools and the age of the solder, somewhere around 60 years ago, in this very shop, back when it was his shop, decades before either Claire or I had been born. "Where did your grandmother get this clock?" I asked her, and I must have said it strangely, because Claire looked at me with real curiosity. She always said it had been her mother's, and before that, I think, her grandmother's, Claire said. "It's been in the family a long time. She grew up not far from here, actually, before she moved away as a young woman. Why?" I turned the case toward her and showed her the tiny worn initials in the corner. "Because my grandfather repaired this clock," I said. "Right here, in this shop, I'd guess around 60 years ago, going by the work, E.C. Ezra Cross. That's him." Claire went very quiet, staring at those small letters, and then she laughed, soft and a little stunned. "My grandmother used to tell me a story," she said slowly, "about a young clockmaker in this town who fixed her family's clock once, when she was a girl, and did such careful, beautiful work that her own mother said he'd clearly done it with more care than the job paid for. She always said, half joking, that she thought about going back one day just to see if he was still there, working, still that careful with things people loved." She looked up at me. I always thought it was just a nice story she liked to tell. I had no idea it might have actually been true. I had no idea it might have been your family at all. We stood there a moment, the two of us, an old dead clock between us on the counter, and something in the room had shifted in a way neither of us said out loud yet. Continued in the next part. I told her the repair would take a couple of weeks. Careful work. An old movement like that, deserving the same patience my grandfather had clearly given it. And instead of simply leaving it and coming back when it was done, Claire started stopping by the shop most afternoons, sometimes with a coffee for each of us, sometimes just to sit on the old stool by the window and talk while I worked. And Poppy, delighted, appointed herself the unofficial supervisor of the whole operation, sorting screws with even more enthusiasm than usual now that there was an audience she liked. Over those 2 weeks, working slow over her grandmother's clock, I learned things about Claire Bennett I hadn't let myself ask about in 18 months of careful distance. I learned that her own parents had a considerable age gap themselves, her father 17 years older than her mother, a marriage everyone around them had quietly doubted at the start, and that had turned out, by every account, to be the steadiest, happiest one in her whole extended family. 2 people who'd simply found each other at the right moment and refused to let arithmetic talk them out of it. I learned that Claire had spent the better part of her early 20s, years most of her friends spent traveling and dating around, caring instead for her grandmother, the very woman who'd owned that clock, through a long, slow decline into dementia. Years that had taught her, she said, more about patience and steadiness, and what actually makes love durable than any 25-year-old's dating life ever could have. She told me, one afternoon, about the last good conversation she'd had with her grandmother, near the very end, on one of the rare clear days that would surface, sometimes even deep into the illness, and how her grandmother had held her hand and told her not to waste her 20s looking for someone easy, that easy never taught you anything worth having, that the people worth keeping were always, in one way or another, a little bit of trouble to love properly, and worth every bit of the trouble. Claire said she'd carried that sentence around for years afterward, not fully understanding it until she watched, from a careful distance, a widowed clockmaker patiently teach his daughter how to sort screws by size on a Tuesday afternoon. She told me, plainly, one afternoon, that she had come out the other side of those years wanting exactly the kind of grounded, unhurried, deeply careful love she'd watched her parents have, and that she had learned, the hard way, not to mistake youth for depth, or a shared decade of birthdays for actual compatibility. "I'm not looking for someone my own age because I think that's supposed to be safer," she told me, over the workbench, not quite meeting my eyes. I spent my 20s taking care of someone at the end of her life, watching how much patience real love actually takes, and it made me impatient with anything less than that. I don't want easy. I want someone who's already learned what matters. You don't get that by being 32. I did not know what to do with that sentence, so, coward that I was being about the whole thing, I mostly changed the subject and kept working. It was on the day I finally finished the clock, cleaned and oiled and ticking steady again for the first time in years, that I made the decision I'd apparently been building toward without fully admitting it. I called Claire and asked if she'd come by that afternoon to see it running, and when she arrived, Poppy conveniently at a friend's house, the shop quiet, and just the 2 of us standing over her grandmother's restored clock, I did the thing I'd been rehearsing, badly, for weeks. I told her I thought she was wonderful. I told her Poppy adored her, that I'd noticed her from the very first week she moved to town, that something in me had woken back up the moment I watched her kneel down to my daughter's height at that fundraiser. And then, because I am, at my core, a careful and cautious man who has spent 2 years building a very sturdy wall around exactly this kind of feeling, I told her that none of it mattered, because I was too old for her, 16 years too old, a widower with a young daughter, and a whole set of habits too settled to be fair to ask a woman her age to take on, and that I thought, for both our sakes, we should just keep things as they were. That's when she smiled, patient, unsurprised, and asked me who had told me that. Nobody told me, I admitted, finally, standing there with the truth I'd been avoiding. I decided it myself. After Diane died, I decided I was finished with all of it, that the responsible thing was to just raise Poppy well and let the rest go. And somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing that was a decision I'd made, and started treating it like a fact about the world. "That's what I thought," Claire said, and she stepped closer, and her voice was steady in a way that made the careful wall I'd built feel suddenly very thin. "Nate, I did not walk into your shop 18 months ago looking for a man my own age. I walked in, actually, looking for exactly nothing, because I'd made a decision or two of my own after watching my grandmother's whole long decline about what I did and didn't have patience for anymore. And then I met a man who fixes broken things with more care than the job requires, who is raising a little girl with more patience and steadiness than most people manage with anyone, and whose grandfather, it turns out, was already quietly repairing my family's history before either of us was born. That's not a coincidence I'm inclined to walk away from over 16 years on a calendar." She reached out and put her hand flat on the glass face of the ticking clock between us. "You keep saying you're too old, like it's a rule somebody handed you. I'm telling you, as the person actually standing here, that nobody handed me that rule, and I don't accept it either. So I'm asking you straight out, is the real reason you keep saying it that you think it's true, or is it that you're scared? And too old is just an easier thing to say out loud than I'm scared of losing someone again." I did not have a clever answer for that either. I just told her the truth, finally, all the way through, that I was terrified, that I had built Poppy's whole steady little world on the promise, mostly to myself, that nothing else in it would ever be allowed to break her heart again, including mine, and that letting myself want something this much again felt like handing the universe one more thing it could someday take away. Claire didn't rush to comfort me out of that fear. She let it sit there a moment, honest and unhidden, and then she said, quietly, "I can't promise you nothing will ever go wrong again, Nate. Nobody can promise that. Not at any age. Not with any gap between 2 birthdays. But I watched my grandmother love my grandfather right up until the day he died, and then keep loving the memory of him for 20 years after, and I never once heard her say she wished she hadn't risked it just because it eventually ended in grief. Grief is just what's on the other side of having loved someone completely. It's not a reason to refuse to start. I keep thinking about Poppy," I admitted, "not just about myself. If I let myself love you and something happens to either of us, that's a second loss I'd be handing her, and she's already carried one loss bigger than any 9-year-old should have to. Or," Claire said, gently, "she gets to grow up watching her father choose to be brave about something, instead of watching him decide, quietly, that being careful was the same thing as being safe. Nate, Poppy doesn't need you to protect her from the possibility of more love in this house. She needs to see what it looks like when someone loves well, on purpose, with their eyes open, even after they've already lost someone. That's a better lesson than never risking it again. I think, somewhere in her, she already knows that. Kids usually do." I stood there with that for a long moment, the clock ticking steadily between us, and I understood, finally, that I had been so busy protecting my daughter from a hypothetical second grief that I had never once considered what it might be costing her to watch her father live like love was something that only happened to him once. Now, here is the part of this story I most want you to hear, because it's the part I'm proudest of, even though it wasn't a grand gesture or a large check refused. It was smaller and harder, and, I think, more honest than any of that. I did not immediately sweep her into my arms and declare the fear conquered, because that would have been a lie, and I was done, standing there in my own shop with my grandfather's initials sitting quietly inside a restored clock between us, telling myself convenient lies. I told her instead that I needed to be honest with her, the way she'd just been honest with me, that I was still scared, that I could not promise her I'd get this right immediately, that I might, out of old habit, try to retreat back behind "too old" more than once, before I fully believed I didn't have to. But I told her, too, that I did not want to spend one more year being careful, and closed off with a woman who had just told me, plainly, that she'd rather have someone honest and afraid than someone safe and absent. I told her I was choosing the harder, riskier thing, on purpose, with my eyes open, because the alternative, the safe, sensible, age-appropriate distance I'd been keeping, had never actually made me feel safe. It had only made me feel alone, in a slightly more organized way. She said that was, as far as she was concerned, exactly the right answer. I want to tell you the true part now, because I promised you this wasn't a fairy tale, and I meant it. Claire and I did not fall into some instant, easy romance the moment I finally said the honest thing out loud. We took it slow and careful, the way you'd handle an old movement full of delicate, valuable parts, because we both understood, from very different corners of grief, exactly how much damage rushing something precious can do. Poppy, it turned out, had noticed far more than I'd ever given her credit for. A few weeks into Claire and me quietly, carefully seeing each other, my daughter cornered me one evening while I was closing up the shop and asked, with the particular bluntness only a 9-year-old can manage, why I'd waited so long to just tell Claire I liked her, since it had been, in Poppy's expert assessment, extremely obvious for at least a year. I asked her, a little sheepishly, how obvious, exactly? She informed me that I hummed different songs when Claire had been by the shop that day, and that grown-ups apparently thought children didn't notice things like that, which was, she said, a very silly thing for grown-ups to think. Poppy, when we finally told her, months later, that Claire and I were officially courting, considered the news with the enormous seriousness of a 9-year-old, and then asked, practically, whether this meant Claire would help her with the harder screw sizes more often, which I took, correctly, as a full and enthusiastic endorsement. We were married a year and a half after that first Tuesday. She walked into my shop with a broken clock in her arms. It was a small wedding, out behind the shop, and Poppy stood up with us, holding, at her own insistence, a small velvet box with the rings, informing every guest who would listen that she had personally supervised the restoration of the very clock that started the whole thing. That clock sits, restored and ticking steadily, on our own mantel now, my grandfather's careful 60-year-old repair, quietly holding time together for a third generation of two families that turned out, in the end, to have never really been strangers at all. There's a version of this where I let "too old" stand as the final word, where I keep the careful wall up forever and call it wisdom instead of fear. And there is no version of that where I get to watch Claire kneel down to Poppy's height every single evening now, the same way she did the very first time I noticed her, or hear that clock ticking on our mantel, keeping the exact kind of patient, careful time my grandfather always believed a good thing deserved. I picked the harder, truer thing. I'd pick it every single time. So let me leave you with this tonight. A man spent 2 years convincing himself a rule existed that nobody had actually handed him, and it took a woman who'd already learned, the hard way, exactly what real patience and real love cost, to ask him the one question that finally cracked it open. Who told you that? So often, the limits we live inside were never handed down by anyone at all. We just got so used to enforcing them ourselves that we forgot we were the ones holding the door shut. So here is what I honestly want to know from you tonight. What rule have you been quietly enforcing on your own life, telling yourself it's just how things are, when really, if you trace it back, nobody ever actually told you that? Too old, too broken, too late, too much, too little. Whose voice is that really? And is it even still in the room with you anymore? Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight yours is the one I most want to hear. And if this story reached you, if you believe, like I've come to believe, that most of our limits are old decisions wearing the costume of facts, then do me one small favor before you go. Subscribe so the next story finds you too. Leave a like so somebody else questioning their own quiet rule finds the courage to ask who actually told them that. And go ask yourself the same question tonight. I'll be right here, reading every word.